From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of all my colleagues, and in particular Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the African and Middle East Division, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm Joan Weeks, head of the Near East section and sponsor of today's program on the Orthodox Church in Georgia since independence by Dr. Paul Crego. Before we start today's program and introduce our speaker, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the division and the resources in the hopes that you'll come back and use the collections and this reading room for your research. This is a custodial division which is comprised of 3 sections that build and serve the collections to researchers from around the world. We cover 75 countries and over 22 languages. The African section includes all the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The Hebraic section covers Judaica and Hebraica worldwide. And the Near East section covers all of the Arab countries of North Africa, the Near East, all of the sections of Turkey, Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, the Muslims in Western China, Russia, the Balkans, and the people of the Caucasus. So you know this is quite an extensive region. And we're particularly pleased today to be covering Georgia in the former Soviet Republic. So before we get started, though, just a couple of things I want to tell you about. We also do programs, and more extensive programs than even this. On June 10th, we have a very exciting program with panels planned from 8:30 to 3:30 over in LJ 119 on the Assyrians and the ancient peoples all through the Middle East, going into Turkey, all the different regions the Assyrians lived. And it's going to be a very exciting program. And as a further incentive, it includes breakfast and lunch. So please mark that on your calendar if you can join us at some point with that. Also, another little housekeeping thing, we'd like to invite you to fill in the questionnaires that you see in your seats. This helps us to plan for future programs to improve and see what you liked and what worked well for you. Then also, we invite you to ask questions. But if you do ask them, since we're videotaping this, you're giving consent to be taped just by default. So just please be aware of that. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Levon Adoyan on here to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Joan. It's wonderful to see so many people here for this special event. And it is also a double pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you, Dr. Paul Crego, who is a senior cataloging specialist and acquisitions librarian in the Israel and Judaica section of the Library of Congress's Asian and Middle East division. He has been my vital partner in the acquisitions of Georgian and Armenian materials for 17 years now, and has brought all of these formats of these collections under bibliographic control for your use. Paul started at the Library of Congress in 1999, and he's responsible for books in Georgian, Armenian, and the languages of Ethiopia. He holds a BA in Soviet and East European Studies from Syracuse University, an MA from Harvard University's Soviet Union program, a Master's of Divinity from the Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in theology from Boston College. His publications include an article with Professor Stephen Rapp, The Conversion of Kartli, the Shatberdi variant from the Kekaladze Institute in Tbilisi, The Ordination of Saint Nino, The Georgian Orthodox Church and Christianity and Politics in the 21st Century, Monks and Monasticism in Georgia in the 19th and 20th centuries, and he co-edited with Stephen Rapp the Georgia volume in the Ashgate series, Languages and Cultures of Eastern Christianity. Now, Paul was a staff fellow in the John W. Kluge Scholarly Center in 2007 to 2008 and spent his years studying the historical and cultural context of the Abkhazian conflict. During his fellowship year, he delivered a number of lectures on issues of language, policy, ethnic identity, and ethnic and national identity in religious contexts. He delivered papers at the Manuscript Center in Tbilisi, Princeton University, and the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. In 2015, Dr. Crego presented papers on the LGBT community in the Republic of Georgia, including religious issues and connections with that community. One at the Crossroads Conference at Baylor University, and the other at the annual meeting of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies in Philadelphia. Well, as you can see, he is uniquely qualified to speak to us on the subject of the Orthodox Church in Georgia since independence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Crego.
Picture it, Ikalto, a small village in Kakheti, that is the eastern part of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. Saturday afternoon, July 7th, 1990. The church, The Church of the Transfiguration, Peritsualeba, also known as Ruftaeba, that is divinity or godliness, among the surviving buildings of a famous medieval theological school. Some of the great philosophical and literary figures had studied here during the heyday of Georgia's Bagratid dynasty and its united kingdom. Not the least of these was the poet Shota Rustaveli, author of the epic poem Vepchist Ausani, The Knight in the Panther Skin. The inside of the church was in poor repair. Water stains were visible. The frescoes had been whitewashed, likely during the Imperial Russian period, when some Georgian churches had their Georgian identities erased. Icons of various styles had been placed in a makeshift iconostasis. Boxes of sand in front of the icons held thin beeswax candles, guttering in the soft, warm, humid breeze. In response to a question asked from among our group of students in Georgia for the first summer school in Kartvelian studies at Tbilisi State University, the Intourist, or Foreign Tourist Service Guide, said that it was not a working church. Shortly after this response, however, the church bells began to chime, and an officiant of some priestly order, who appeared as if he had been waiting in the very wall of the church for his cue, placed his service books on a lectern and began to chant what was likely the vigil of the resurrection. We wondered whether we had witnessed the first service in the new life of this Church of the Transfiguration. Certainly, it was among the first and represented, iconified, if you will, the transfiguration already well underway in the Georgian Orthodox Church and in the Georgian nation. We were witnessing the beginning of a remarkable new era after nearly 7 decades of Soviet rule and its companion policy of official state-sponsored atheism. Although the Soviet Union did not officially cease to exist until the end of 1991, there are 2 dates before the official end that are essential starting points for the concept of this paper. The first is December 25th, 1977. The Orthodox Church in Georgia uses what's called the Old Calendar, so this is not Christmas, but about 2 weeks before. This was the day when the current Patriarch Catholicos of the Georgian Church, Ilya II, was enthroned. Although with some difficult times early in his reign as Catholicos, Ilya II emerged in the 1980s as the leader who would begin to revive the Orthodox Church in Georgia. He saw into a future that held much promise for a renewed church when independence would come again to Georgia. The second date is April 9th, 1989. It was on an early Sunday morning when Soviet troops attempting to disperse a demonstration that had been developing for several weeks fired upon the crowd. 19 people were killed, among them 17 women, and many more were injured. April 9th, 1989 was the day that Soviet power died in Georgia. Huge funeral liturgies soon became rallies for the resurrection of the nation. Yes, there were political structures that lingered, and the Communist Party shambled on. For the Georgian people, however, communist rule was but a hulking corpse that was left then only further to decay. Within a year, there was a box in front of the Supreme Soviet building, now the Parliament, and near the memorial for the victims of April 9th. And on this box, there was an invitation for people to place their communist cards into the dustbin of history. In my brief time today, I want to touch on a number of different topics: the growth of the Orthodox Church in Georgia, church-state relations, the Orthodox Church in society, and some publications of the Church. Let me pause at this point to thank the African and Middle East Division for inviting me to speak today, particularly Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, Chief, Joan Weeks, head of the Near East section, and Dr. Levon Avdoyan, my reference colleague in matters Armenian and Georgian. And if anyone wants to know, I have been studying the Georgian language since 1977, and a great deal of my research concerning the Orthodox Church in Georgia involves reading Georgian language sources. The enthronement of Ilya II as Catholicos Patriarch of the Orthodox Church in Georgia marked a point after which this autocephalous church began to experience a reversal of its fortune. Although still in the time of Brezhnev, conditions in Georgia were more favorable than in some of the other parts of the Soviet Union. They continued to improve during the Gorbachev years of glasnost. And there's poor old Lenin with his head bashed in near the Natakhtari beer and soda bottling plant north of Mtsketa. And what was Lenin Square when I was there in 1990 is now Freedom Square, with a statue topped by a golden St. George slaying his dragon. Sadly, I missed Lenin coming down by only about a week. There had been rumors all summer, and we even got on the bus to go to Lenin Square at the time to see it come down, but we heard that the Georgians had forgotten ropes and such by which to haul it down. Anyway, one of the most important early events for the future of the church was the opening of the Tbilisi Spiritual Academy in October 1988, across from the Sioni or Zion Cathedral. This spiritual academy was a companion to the seminary in Mtskheta that had sometimes been opened during the Soviet period. Before his enthronement, Ilya II had been rector of the Mtskheta Theological Seminary from 1963 to 1972. And in 1989, the ancient autocephaly, or self-governing status, of the Orthodox Church in Georgia was officially recognized by the Patriarch of Constantinople. The pace of change picked up in the 1990s and into the 21st century. At his enthronement in 1977, only 5 eparchies existed in Georgia. There are now 50, including 7 outside of the Republic of Georgia's territory. The first years of the new century saw a great deal of new church construction and renovation. The numbers of working churches has increased from probably no more than a couple of dozen to over 850 by 2007. We'll come back to that one. Political leaders got in on the building. Eduard Shevardnadze, who became the head of state in 1992 and was later elected president under the 1995 Constitution and served until the Revolution of the Roses in November 2003, sponsored the reconstruction of the St. Nicholas Church in the Narikala fortress, overlooking the old part of Tbilisi. He was, by the way, baptized Georgi by the Patriarch himself. From before 1990, the Orthodox Church in Georgia had begun to make plans for the construction of a new cathedral. It was to be called the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity. A competition among architects was held in 1990. But with the economy in ruins in the 1990s, it became impossible to raise funds for the new cathedral. Finally, in the opening years of the 21st century, earnest construction began with a large contribution from Bidzina Ivanishvili, who had made his money in Russia during the 1990s, when that country's economy was largely unfettered by regulation. This is the same Ivanishvili who became Prime Minister of Georgia after the parliamentary elections of 2012. Churches were built in Tbilisi and elsewhere, others repaired and put back together, literally putting the stones back up in order for the churches again to exist. These included the Church of St. David the Builder, who had been the ruler of Georgia in its in the Middle Ages when Georgia was at its largest extent. This church was built on the grounds of Tbilisi State University. Let's look a little at the Church of the Holy Trinity as it was built. This was in late May or early July 2000 or early June 2004. You can see some of the ornamentation that was waiting to go up. Not all of the technology was 21st century. This is an inside view looking at the altar where the iconostasis now is, and up on the top of the apse overlooking the altar, there are now tracings in which a new mosaic of Christ the Pantocrator, or the Almighty, will be put. Just a view to show you how much this new church dominates the landscape in Tbilisi. Another new church, they're not all big, is the small church honoring Saint Abu of Tbilisi, an early medieval martyr who had been a perfumer in Baghdad, moved to Tbilisi, converted to Christianity, and then was martyred for his trouble. The Monastery of the Holy Cross, a 6th century establishment, actually the first church here is 4th century, What's left there now is as old as the 6th century. It's a common place for wedding parties to come so that the couple can be blessed by the priests who are there. Now, some of the women wear very high heels, and there's a slab of concrete just down the stairs from the church that overlooks the Aragvi and Mtkvari River, or Kura if you need a better vowel to consonant ratio. But it's steep, and they don't want people wearing stilettos to go over the cliff. Another of the churches is a small basilica called the Antakya Church, which is also in Mskheta, part of the complex of the women's monastery at the Samtavro Church in Mskheta. I'm afraid sometimes I intrude on the pictures. That's Professor Stephen Rapp, with whom I've done some writing and editing. Inside the Antakya Church, some new frescoes. This is the scene with Saint Nino, equal to the apostles and enlightener of the Georgians, when she prays for the pagan idols to be blown off the hill. It's a significant part of her story. St. John the Baptist Monastery is out in the eastern part of Georgia, where things get very dry. And actually, that cliff on the side is where the monastery is. There's a church inside there, and a refectory, and there are also monks' residences cut into the cliff. And yes, it was that blue that day. My memory is getting to the monastery. It was the feast of Saints Helena and Constantine. So at 10 o'clock, there was a festive lunch, and the red liquid coming out of the Coke bottles was, of course, some good Georgian wine. And they were at the time building a new retreat center for the faithful who would come on pilgrimage. There's St. Nino's Spring in Bodby, and there is a large tank of water here. If you want to be fully sanctified, you dunk your whole body in it. I just kind of washed my head, but others were more exuberant in their piety than I was. This is down the hill from the main cathedral at Bodby, which means it's a long climb back up. And the Ananuri Church, which is, as Georgian churches go, a fairly new one, only about the 17th century. And this is along the Aragvi River north of Mskheta by an hour or so. I couldn't resist this picture of the little fisherman who had a very ambitious project. If he had filled that fish net, I think he would have had fish to equal his own weight. Another of the churches that has been rebuilt, and this one to some controversy, the ruins of this cathedral were on the UNESCO list, and former President Mikhail Saakashvili, as one of his projects, and also a project of the church, was to have this rebuilt. And it has not been rebuilt to the specifications of many people, and much controversy has ensued. An excursion into the countryside reveals dozens, if not hundreds, of small basilica churches that have been cobbled together, like that Antakya church, in the past generation. One of the measures undertaken by the church in recent years is the repatriation of old church buildings in the Georgian territory of Svaneti. This relatively remote part of the country that stretches into the mountains and all the way to the border with the Russian Federation is covered with small basilica-type churches. Many of these churches, often in the possession of families within the villages, had become sites of non-Christian rituals. In the past decade, the Patriarchate has successfully recovered most of these for Christian worship. One source has indicated to me that this was met with little opposition and that, in fact, the residents of Svaneti were grateful for the reestablishment of normative Christian ritual and belief. This is one of those churches. A lot of these are about 900 or 1,000 years old. This is Nakipati, which is on a bend of the Inguri River, church named for St. George. Svaneti is the only place where I've seen churches in honor of the prophet Jonah. You will remember the whiny prophet in the Hebrew scriptures whose famous line was, well, God, I knew you'd change your mind and you'd be nice to these people. So perhaps that is part of the reason that Jonah gets churches named for him. That's one of my favorite pictures. This is the Lamartia Church in Ushkuli, which is just about as far as you can get on the Georgian side of the border as you're heading into the Caucasus Mountains. There is a glacier around the corner that feeds the Nguri River that finally goes to the Black Sea. If you haven't been to Svaneti, I recommend it. So a little bit about church-state relations. As noted above, when the Republic of Georgia emerged from the rubble of the Soviet Union as a free and sovereign nation, the Orthodox Church found itself in a new political context. After nearly 7 decades of militant and often crass and bullying, government-sponsored official atheism, the Orthodox Church in Georgia began again to exert its role as a foundational institution in Georgian society. This foundation was supported by Georgia's first post-Soviet president, Zviad Gamsaxurdia, who ironically was driven from power nearly at the same time that the Soviet Union finally collapsed. He promoted a close relationship with the Orthodox Church, in part as a guarantor of the Georgian nation and its freedom. In political speeches, he reminded his listeners that Georgia as the lot, the word in Georgian is tilchvedri, of the Theotokos. This is a reference to the story that the apostles, including the Virgin Mary, had divided missionary assignments up by casting lots, and Georgia fell to Mary. After communication from her son, however, she came to understand that she would not be able to fulfill this mission, and St. Andrew, the first called, took her place. This understanding of the special protection of Georgia by the Theotokos became an important theme for the Church in its relationship to the nation. For the Orthodox Church in Georgia, this has meant not only a belief in her protection, but a severe responsibility to maintain the nation as worthy of that protection. In extreme cases, this is an issue for those who seek to rid the nation of its impure others. Gamsaxurdia's support had been a little more than ironic, steeped as he was in the belief system of Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. Articles in the Orthodox Church's press attacking Steinerism appeared only years after Gamsaxurdia's death, but it was clear that they were kicking his corpse. At first, the Republic of Georgia operated under the 1921 Constitution of the Democratic Republic of Georgia that had codified a separation of church and state, already in existence from the early days of that republic. a separation that had actually been more separate than the church had desired. Georgia adopted a new constitution in 1995, several years after Shevardnadze had returned to power. This constitution enshrined the Orthodox Church as the first among equals. Freedom of religion is guaranteed, but the Constitution also speaks of the historical precedents of orthodoxy in Georgia. No other religion or Christian denomination is mentioned as having this sort of historical relevance. Article 9 of the Constitution, as amended, reads, "The state proclaims the full freedom of belief and confession, at the same time acknowledging the special role Georgia's Apostolic Autocephalous Orthodox Church has played in Georgia's history and also recognizes its independence from the state. The relationship of Georgia's state and Georgia's Apostolic Autocephalous Orthodox Church is to be defined by a constitutional concordat. The constitutional concordat is to be consistent in general with all internationally recognized principles and norms, specifically in the sphere of fundamental human rights." This constitutionally mandated concordat between the government and the church was eventually signed on October 14, 2002, by President Shevardnadze and Patriarch Catholicos Ilya II at the Church of the Living Pillars Sveti Tchoveli in the old capital city of Mtskheta. This document provided details for the relationship of church and state in Georgia and ratified its primary status above other religious groups. Specifically, the special status of the church included tax exemptions, clerical release from military service, and a special legal status for the patriarch. A commentary on the Concordat, its title translated into English, Commentaries on the Constitutional Concordat between the Government of Georgia and Georgia's Apostolic Autocephalous Orthodox Church, was written by David Chikviadze. He promoted the idea that the Concordat had made the Orthodox Church in Georgia the official state church. While I do not believe this is technically so, the Orthodox Church is often operated as though it had been made such. This is especially noted in its reported interference in the property rights of other churches and religious communities. The ambiguity concerning that status of other religions and other Christian denominations was somewhat ameliorated with the religious law that came into effect in July 2012. The first two readings of this legislation had included only what was referred to in some documents as the 7 historic religious communities: Orthodoxy, Catholicism, the Lutherans, Baptists, Jews, Muslims, and the Armenian Apostolic Church. Jews have been present in Georgia and other South Caucasian territories since early after the Babylonian captivity. Muslims since the 2nd generation after Muhammad, and Armenian and Georgian Christians have lived intermingled since the early days of Christianity in the South Caucasus. Catholic missionaries were present in Georgia in medieval times. Baptists and Lutherans have been present since the 19th century, and as a result of religious movements coming by way of the Russian Empire. In between the second and third readings of the 2012 law, the Committee on European Integration widely expanded the number of religious communities to conform to those recognized by the European Council. The Orthodox Church had not been consulted on this change and reacted adversely to the broad expansion of the new law. After some reconsideration of its public stance, the Synod of the Orthodox Church in Georgia backed down from its most severe criticism of the new law. At this point, the Church seemed to have realized that its overreach was leading to bad publicity, not only in Georgia, but around the world. At the same time, the Synod insisted that the Parliament should consult with it when laws affecting religion were under consideration. There is generally an ongoing and complex relationship of the Orthodox Church in Georgia with not only its place in the nation, but also its relationship with a government that promotes a European or Western orientation, complete with the promotion of civil and human rights. The Orthodox Church in this time of independence has been anxious about the way in which they understand how freedom can quickly become a free-for-all sort of attitude toward ethical and moral norms. There is no question that the Orthodox Church is the most respected institution in Georgian society, and that the Patriarch Catholicos Ilya II is the most respected individual in the Republic of Georgia. This has been so for most of the years since Georgia regained its independence. It is as much so now as the campaign for the October parliamentary elections have revealed a widespread disdain for many of the political parties and coalitions currently in the Georgian parliament. On the other hand, it has been difficult for the Orthodox Church, as for churches of many sorts in post-Soviet states, to adjust to the new social and political realities of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The effect of 7 decades of Soviet rule in Georgia on the Orthodox Church and other religious communities cannot be overestimated. One of the historical developments, or better, non-developments, of the Orthodox churches in Soviet time and space was that it prevented these communities from the sort of modern discussion and debates that characterized Christianity in other parts of the world in that century. In the few churches that survived the communist regime, liturgy was preserved, but talk of modernizing liturgical language or the education of the faithful or involvement in social activities was forbidden. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Orthodox Church in Georgia, in response to the dire economic and social needs of the Georgian people, became involved again in the social sphere. Since 1994, the church's Lazarus Foundation has been a mainstay of large-scale relief work in society. One of the more difficult adjustments in this new time has involved ecumenical relations. For a time, the church in Georgia played a role, if only a small one, in the global ecumenical movement. Ilya II was, for a time, a president of the World Council of Churches. While this title did not mean that he was involved in the day-to-day operations of the council, the position was a recognition of Ilya II's importance in the revival of churches in post-Soviet space. In the 1990s, the Orthodox churches in general and the Orthodox Church in Georgia in particular began more closely to assess their participation in dialogue with other Christian bodies. Some of the non-canonical churches, calling themselves Orthodox, had proclaimed ecumenism a heresy, and this notion began to be expressed in all parts of Orthodoxy, including Georgia's. 2 non-canonical Orthodox churches have existed in Georgia. One of them, styled at first as the true Orthodox Church of Georgia, was under the authority of the Metropolitan of Boston, yes, Boston, Massachusetts, at the Monastery of the Holy Transfiguration in Brookline, Massachusetts. The other was a small group led by the violent and notorious Father Basil Makalavashvili, and under the authority of a schismatic Greek church known as the Synod of Resistance. Some of the monks of the Orthodox Church were also almost in schism from the main church over the issue of ecumenism. Their influence was part of the Georgian Church's decision to leave both the World Council of Churches and the Conference of European Churches in 1997. Officially, the Georgian Synod cited the, quote, World Council of Churches leadership's continued efforts to endow the organization with unified ecclesiological functions, end of quote, and the WCC's alleged, quote, failure to take interests of the Orthodox Church fully into account, end of quote, as reasons for their action. Many of the anti-ecumenical monks were disciplined for their rebellion, despite the fact that some of their agenda was enacted and has remained the position of the Orthodox Church in Georgia ever since. As an example of this, in the preliminary meetings of the Orthodox churches for the Holy and Great Synod of the Orthodox Church, soon to take place on Crete, and in subsequent articles, Georgian authors have been very critical of any ongoing dialogue with other communities who call themselves Christian. Their first point, and really their only point, is that there can only be one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that all the heterodox are therefore not the Church. They have also encouraged the designation of ecumenism as heresy. This, of course, has also repercussions in how the Orthodox Church deals with other Christians and non-Christians in the Republic of Georgia. One of my sources said, well, they're actually doing business for Moscow, the Moscow Patriarchate, and the Russian Church, while the Russian Church can have its hands clean from disrupting the Great Synod. Another large conflict of the Orthodox Church in Georgia has involved the small LGBT community there. This conflict came to a head on May 17, 2013. A small group of demonstrators, only a couple of dozen at the most, had gathered in Tbilisi to observe the International Day Against Homophobia. They were besieged by a huge counter-demonstration led by Orthodox priests, all of whom, priests and other demonstrators, were breathing violence against the first group. Those observing the Idaho Day, as it's called, fearing for their very lives, were hustled onto buses by police. The Orthodox Church has since named the 17th of May to be Family Day. This year, it was observed by the presence of the World Congress of Families, a group founded in the United States, encouraged by official Russia, and a group that has been designated a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, I recognize that this issue is one of no small controversy and one that cannot be dealt with at length here. I will drop one observation, however, into the mix. Some officials of the Orthodox Church refer to homosexuality as a disease. They do not necessarily, however, mean this as an individual's disease, which would then elicit a pastoral response. But rather, they consider it a disease of the body politic that must therefore be eradicated from the nation in order to avoid apocalyptic consequences. That's another talk altogether. But since we are at the Library of Congress, I thought it appropriate to do some bibliographic work. specifically to speak of some of the resources published by the Orthodox Church in Georgia. Periodical literature slowly began to become available in the late 1980s and early 1990s, published by the church. There were also other religious publications. There was something called the Old Orthodox Union that was publishing newspapers in the summer of 1990. They were off the charts, obscurantists. One of the first journals was called Zviad Cross of the Grapevine, a reference to the cross of St. Nino that is described in hagiography, first published in 1989. An important newspaper, Modely, or Grace, as you see here, appeared first in April 1990. These and other publications had as a primary goal the basic education of the faithful, who had generally been prohibited from learning much of anything about their faith. Some had been baptized along the way, a phenomenon not unknown in other churches across the Soviet Union, but were still ignorant of the fundamentals. As the Georgian economy strengthened at the beginning of the 20th century and into its second decade, the number of magazines and journals proliferated in Georgia. One of my acquisition goals has been to acquire serial publications of all sorts, but especially religious ones. I have been able to buy issues of the periodical published by the eparchy in Svaneti in farthest Ushguli at the Lamaria Church that was in the picture just in the shadow of the glaciers. And certainly this is a sign of the revival of the orthodoxy in Svaneti. Just a sample of the others. There's something called Erti Kadageba, one sermon. As the title indicates, it's one sermon by the patriarch or by an archbishop or a bishop or a priest or a monk. And these come out quite frequently. At one time, there was something called Kva Kuthedi, or Cornerstone. This bills itself as a national religious journal, and so it's a little bit more on the conservative side, wherein the church and the idea of church and nation, church and state is much more tightly held. Some of these I don't know if they're in publication anymore. I certainly didn't see all of these when I was there earlier in May this year. Machveli Messiisa, the sword of the Messiah. And this is the official publication of the Urbnisi and Vruisi eparchy, which is northwest of Tbilisi. I'm sorry, Mtskemsi Ketili, the Good Shepherd, which is just a general publication. Krialosani, or prayer beads, another publication that tends to be on the conservative side. Pudze, or foundation, and this is especially for Georgians who live outside of Georgia. This and another one with the same goal could be found generally only at the big church of the Holy Trinity, with the idea that pilgrims visiting the homeland would certainly visit the new cathedral, and there they could buy these publications. I didn't see either one of them last month. Natalia, or godparent. Achel especially for youth. Tanamemamule, which means compatriot, was another publication for Georgians living outside of Georgia. And as some of the Georgians will know, any Georgian living outside of Georgia is only temporarily living outside of Georgia. His Holiness in Beatitude Ilya II and some of his pastoral letters in the long list of people he's addressing will refer to those Georgians temporarily living outside of the homeland. This is Gzad Cheshmariteba, The Way and the Truth, which is the official paper of the Alaverdi Diocese that is in eastern Georgia. You can buy some of the monks' honey here. The church has been redone since the first time I saw it in 1990, when the inside was all taken up with scaffolding of the sort that made my fear of heights much exaggerated. Alleluia, a children's publication. And Maklovani. This refers to the bramble bush under which St. Nino lived during her early years in Mtscheta, but it's also the word that's used for the bramble bush in Exodus 3, where Moses encounters the divine being in the burning bush, and as we know, the burning bush is a type or a prefiguration of the Virgin Mary. That is, something in which divinity was enclosed but was not consumed by divinity. So we've got St. Nino and Moses and the Blessed Virgin Mary all expressed in the title of this journal put out by the Women's Monastery in Mtscheta. This then has been a very short précis of the Orthodox Church in Georgia and some of its growth into the leading institution in Georgian society, and a brief introduction to some of the issues that this church has faced in this first generation of Georgia's new independence. Thank you, and I think there's a few minutes for questions, just a few, 3 questions. You want to moderate the questions?
No, we'll go right ahead and call.
Okay. Anybody got a question? Alex?
Alex, thank you, Paul. I have 2 questions. One is, you showed us pictures of very large new churches in Galicia. During services, how well are they used? Are they full congregations?
Crowded.
And the second question, you showed a church, you said it was controversial in its design.
Or controversially rebuilt, yes.
It's an architectural controversy. What is that?
Part of it is architectural. I didn't show you the back side of it, which has some modifications that basically I think what they did was they put a part of the old ruins on the side of the church in an enclosure that doesn't match anything. In a dark, I think mostly glass enclosure, but it looks out of place. And of course, on the UNESCO list of things, rebuilding things from ruins is essentially a no-no. But I suppose I do side with the church on this one, that the most important thing about a church is that you can use it. And being in ruins, you can't use it, so you fix it. Now, they might have fixed it better, but that's the principle. Yes?
With the church being suppressed for so long and so much interest, how did they, and no infrastructure for creating clergy, where did all the clergy come from? Are they coming from Boston, or where are they coming from to support all these churches?
They're locals, a lot of them converts at the end of the Soviet period and the early period of independence. Some have accused the clergy of being rushed into their orders and not having received enough education. Some also say that they're thieves, but that's another, that's probably more of an assessment of people who don't like the church at all. But there is a problem with education, because the theological educational institutions just weren't there, and it's been a long process. And 25 years is too short a time to really to regroup. Kathy?
I have two quick questions. One is, as I recall, Georgia is unique among post-Soviet states in not requiring registration of religious communities. Is that still true? The other question has to do with the Georgian Orthodox Church's attitudes towards ecumenical. I was just in Moscow and heard that there's also serious tensions inside the Moscow Patriarchate over the Pope Patriarch on exactly.
I'm sorry, the second part of that question? The second part of the question?
Having to do with ecumenism, correct? Correct. Inside tensions over ecumenism inside the Georgian Orthodox Church, being parallel inside the Moscow Patriarchate.
Compare the tensions of ecumenicalism in the Georgian Church to the Russian Church.
Oh, the Georgian and the Russian churches very much agree on ecumenism. They don't like it. Even though the Russian church at the synod, the upcoming synod, has tried to play itself above the fray. The statements over the last 20 years have been generally fairly anti-ecumenical. As to the other part of your question, which was registration, I don't believe there's registration, but there's still property disputes. I heard, when I was there in May, I heard about a Catholic church being taken over by an Orthodox church and having its Catholic things taken out and whitewashed and such. One more, Angela?
What does the church today, does it hold some sort of opinion about Islam? How does it represent its past?
There are some priests that say nice things about Stalin, but I would say Stalin is remembered better in Russia than he is in Georgia. That's been my impression. So is that?
Is there some nostalgia for the
Oh, by older people sometimes, but it's so different from what it was. I mean, having been there in 1990 and having returned 10 times after that, I would never go back to the empty shelves of 1990. I mean, there were very difficult years in the early 90s in Georgia, and there's still difficulties because of the wide income ranges that are present there. Lots of poverty, and a few people like former Prime Minister Bidzina Ivanishvili, who have so much money that in his, well, I can only call it a palace, and my reference is to, well, if you watch the Jetsons, and if you wanted to design the house of a rich man on a hill that would fit into the Jetsons, this would be it. He has a shark, at least, and a zebra and penguins in this building. And he also has a place out in western Georgia. And recently, there were pictures of a large tree that he had uprooted somewhere being taken on a barge over the Black Sea to wherever it was going to be transplanted. But that's Bidzina.
Stay here.
Oh,
This has been, as I said, a pleasure for me to introduce Paul, who's not only a valued colleague, but a friend. I think he will agree with me when I say that Georgia is a place you want to visit, you have to visit, and you will always remember visiting. It is a special place, along with Armenia and Georgia, a special place in both our hearts. I want to thank Dr. Crego for a superb lecture. I would love to thank you for coming, especially on this holiday week. And I hope you will consider visiting the African and Middle Eastern Division to do your research or just to visit in the future. And on June 10th, please consider attending the all-day seminar conference on the Assyrians, the modern-day Assyrians. And Paul, thank you so much for your lecture.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.